Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion will be part 4 of an ongoing series focusing on modern management in Intune, specifically client apps, and the specific topic within client apps today will be app configuration policies. Here's our agenda. Basically, a discussion, what are app configuration policies and why they're beneficial, why you care about them, want to walk through app configuration policies, talk about some of the requirements, some scenarios where you will find these, and then give you a few demos of these app config policies in action. We will wrap up with a bit of troubleshooting tips and tricks and things I want to show you that can help you as you're working with app config policies in your environment. So first, what are app config policies? Well, put simply, these app config policies allow you to define, provide specific configuration settings to applications that can accept them on your managed devices, right? You'll see some examples of that. So specifically iOS and Android is what we're talking about here, being able to provide settings in that world. Now, in terms of targeting, right, we can think of targeting these config policies in two ways. One is targeting to the managed app. Another is targeting to the device. You're going to hear me talk about these different types of targeting a few times through the session because it's important to understand the difference. It's important to understand the scenarios. You'll see two scenarios for targeting the managed apps. You'll see two scenarios for targeting the managed device. So we'll unpack that more as we go along. And then the last bullet, app config policy equals man. Absolutely not, right? App config policy is separate from MAM. App config policy can complement MAM, but is not MAM itself. So under the MAM umbrella, we talked about in a previous session, app protection policy, right? So again, app protection policy and config policy can be hand in hand. They don't necessarily have to be, and I'll explain that as we go along as well. So why app config policy? Well, it's all about trying to improve the user experience. So let's just take Outlook as an example. A user might install Outlook and they will open it up, and the first thing they need to do is provide settings to be able to get to Outlook. Usually it's just to sign in to Outlook, but there may be some other things that you're trying to have consistency for across your environment. Maybe you want to configure so certain things aren't allowed, maybe email signatures or a certain thing, or whatever the case may be, right? So you have the ability to provide these configs universally across the platform of users that are using this particular application, right? So very definitely, and you'll see examples of that. Configuration consistency, same kind of thing. So if you have managed devices, you want to make sure they're configured consistently as they interact with your various services in the business, then you can do that. Customization, right? And then app customization itself. So there's configuration customization and then possibly the app customization. So to delineate that, again, two scenarios coming up. Maybe it's configuring Outlook so that you don't allow a focused inbox, as an example. Maybe it's app customization. So so configuration customization might be an email account. Sorry, app customization might be the focused inbox, right? So couple, basically just customization ability. Okay, what are the requirements of this? Well, this is iOS, it is Android focus that we're talking about. There's two ways that you can deliver configurations to applications. The first is that the app itself is what's referred to as an enlightened or a managed application. These are apps that are provided by the vendor that leverage the Intune SDK. These apps specifically do not require the device to be managed in order to deliver the configuration. Now, the device could be managed, that's fine, but if you're trying to do like a BYOD scenario and all you're wanting to do is provide management of the app itself, there's no requirement with enlightened or managed applications that the device itself be enrolled. Rather, the user would obtain the app on the device from the Apple or the Google stores, right? You could also deploy it. There's some experience type stuff, with that. So generally the user would go download it from the Apple or the Google store. So one thing that I'll call out. So there's a conflict that I found, I believe, in our documentation. And as of this recording, I've provided the feedback, we'll see. But if you look in some of our documentation, you will see a reference that says app config policy requires that app protection policy is also configured. Right? I've experienced that, I think, myself. The reason I say I think, I'll explain in just a minute. But with an enlightened app, with a managed app, if you're in that scenario anyway, this kind of really isn't a big deal to call this out, because it makes sense if you're in an enlightened, a managed app situation where you're using the Intune SDK, that you would want to provide app protection policy right along beside app config policy. So you likely won't be trying to apply app config policy to an enlightened or a managed app if you haven't already provided app protection policy, right? But I do want to call that out because in a minute you'll hear another statement that seems to conflict with this, and so just calling that out here, and I'll refer back to it when I get there, right? The other way that you can target the app config deployment is to a managed device. So this is specifically where the device itself is managed, and where the Intune admin is going to actually deploy the app. And specifically here, you're going to want to make sure that the app you're deploying is capable of accepting configuration. Some apps are, some apps aren't. We'll talk about that more a little bit. For example, managed apps, enlightened apps are capable of receiving configuration because they use the Intune SDK. But the Intune SDK isn't required. There are other apps that are just as capable of receiving the app configuration from Intune whenever you deploy it down. In that case, though, it's not an enlightened managed app. It is an app you deploy to the device, and then the configuration goes kind of on top of that. So to call that out, specifically in that case, you cannot supply app protection policy for those applications because they are not managed enlightened apps, and so you would just apply in that case the configuration policy, right? So however you do it, consult the vendor to confirm the app actually supports the configuration, and if it does, then we can deliver that by Intune. So to keep belaboring that point for a minute, do you target your app configurations to the user or to the device? And so specifically for a managed app, the assumption is that you're not necessarily going to have that device where the app is installed managed, right? And so in that case, you would target the user for a managed app. If it's a managed device, then you could target the user or target the device. There's some reasons to target the device sometimes versus targeting the user. So again, look at the docs. The Outlook app is what I'm thinking about, has really good docs to detail in certain scenarios. You might want to target it one way versus the other. Okay. So in terms of scenarios, right? Again, some of this kind of is a little bit of a repeat, but just to do it again. The platforms we support, iOS and Android, for app config policy. The configuration targeting, we just spent some time on that. We'll do it again in a minute. Managed app or managed device, right? Those are the two ways in the Intune console that you will see that you can target your app config policy. It will be listed as managed app or managed device. Now, how do you actually configure the app config policy onto applications that are able to accept it? There's three broad ways, right? You're going to, if you have the ability to use what's called the configuration designer, that's going to make it much more straightforward in doing your configuration. So absolutely use that. You'll see an example of doing that, a couple of examples actually, as we go along. Where you don't have the GUI, the nice GUI configuration designer, you can still supply the configuration using name value pairs. You'll see an example of that. You can also supply the configuration with XML. You'll see an example of that, and we'll go through it. One thing also to understand about app config policy, and this is also true for app protection policy, even though we I already did a session on that. In most places, whenever you're configuring and deploying something in Intune, that is effectively a push. It's really not, but effectively it looks like a push, right? We're notifying, the way that works, not to get too deep into this, the way that works is when you configure and deploy something to a group in Intune, we will notify that device that it now has a new configuration so that it pretty much immediately will go and check in and do whatever thing that has been configured for it. That is not true of app config policy. App config policy is a pull, not a push. Detail more about that in a minute. Why do we know? Why do we need to know that? Because if you're expecting that you will configure a new app config policy onto an application, and you will open that application and that app config policy will immediately apply, you may be disappointed. It may happen that way, but it may take longer to happen, right? Up to 30 minutes, or in some scenarios beyond 30 minutes. Again, I'll tell you about that as we start to wrap up the session, probably. Okay. And then we'll go to the XML in a scenario, but I want to call this out, right? We absolutely do support providing configs to apps using XML, right? Normally, you're probably not going to be using that because there's other ways to do it. And so typically, you're probably not going to have to edit XML, but in some scenarios you will, and it's not difficult. And so we do support it. So here's what it would look like, right? Again, we'll go into this a little bit more in a minute. So this would be a definition XML for Intune. And you see it starts up here with this label and ends with the same label. And in between are all the configs. So we'll provide the key name, we'll provide, this is a string value, and all of these in this example are string values. And notice the format of this user principal name and mail and partial UPN and account ID and all this different stuff. This is enclosed in brackets, and this is also referred to on the right-hand side as a token, right? Another word for token is a wildcard, right? So think about configuring email profiles, and that's one you'll see, right? You might want to lift certain wildcard information from Azure AD and so on to supply in a configuration request whenever you're trying to form an email address or something like that for the user who's logged in. These wildcards, these tokens, allow you to do that. Otherwise, you would have to specify statically the configuration information, and whenever you're deploying config policy to hundreds of managed devices for Outlook email profiles, that's probably not friendly, right? These tokens will help you do that a lot more effectively. And then in terms of the property list, these are the properties that Intune supports. So integer, real, string, array, this dict, I believe it means dictionary. I haven't looked that up, but that's the label. The one thing you won't notice here, and it's really important, and I'll show it to you in a minute, is Boolean. Because some of the examples that you will receive from vendors will state Boolean. Well, Intune doesn't support Boolean. It does support Boolean in that you can put true false, right? But there's a specific way that you have to do that, as I'll explain more as we go along. Okay, so let's get into the fun stuff and actually see this work. There's going to be a few demos we're going to do. The way I'm going to do this is, these are already configured. I've already got them configured. I'm going to go through and configure them again as if I don't, so that you can see that process. Then I'll show you the configuration that I have in place, and we will see it work on the iOS device, which is also a point. So all of these demos that I'm going to do here in this session are going to be on iOS. The Android experience is similar. So I didn't pull in any Android devices because the same concepts apply to Android as they do to iOS. Okay, so this specific demo, Demo 1, Demo 2 will both be on Outlook. And so let me pull in the Intune console and show you how this is set up. And actually, before I do that, let me give you the details. So here on this one, the configuration source, the way I'm actually getting that app config data to the device is by using or to the app is by using the configuration designer. Very easy experience, as you'll see. Here, I'm targeting a managed app. Why? because the device itself is not going to be managed. I can do this to a device that is either unmanaged or managed, doesn't matter really. But in my case, the device is going to be unmanaged. So the app itself is going to be an Intune SDK enlightened app, Outlook, and so it can receive those settings. And so the app config policy you'll see in a minute is config Outlook settings. Let me pull in the Intune console. Here we are. So the first place I want to land is to show you that I do not have this device in Intune at all. So as I look at Azure AD and get to devices, we'll see that it's not here. It's an Azure AD, probably because I didn't clean it up, but it's definitely not in Intune. Why did I do that? I need to be in the Intune console. Let me get back there. Sorry. Dashboard and Intune console. That's where I really want to be. Now devices. Here's where I want to be. Right? So as I look at the list of devices that are listed here, we will not see my iOS device. All right, and look at all devices. And I do have one of them. This is the other one that I'll use, but it is the only, that's the only iOS device. This is actually duplicated from some of the testing I've done. My other iPhone, sorry, not iPad, is not here. So you'll have to trust me on that, but it's not, right? And so let's go back and look at client apps specifically now, and app config policy specifically under that when this blade comes up. Okay, so app config policies, and so what you'll see, let me make this more readable. What you'll see is there's two app config policies for Outlook, one for the account and one for settings. So the one for settings is the one that we care about right now. Okay, so again, the scenario, this is a managed app. I called out before that you will find in some documentation a statement that says in order for app config policy to apply to a managed app, you also need to have app protection policy applied to that managed app. Again, I'm suggesting some document edits as of this recording. They haven't gone through, have been reviewed, but that does conflict seemingly with another statement a little bit later that I will get to and try to tie it together. But this is a managed app, right? Now, I'll show you that in just a minute, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to create a new app config policy, essentially like I've already done, and show you how that looks. I'll just do that. Doesn't really matter. Now, device enrollment type. Specifically here, I'm going to choose managed app, okay? But again, I'm going to hit this a couple of times because it's important. When you choose managed app, that is when the app you're trying to provide configuration for is engineered by the vendor to leverage the Intune SDK. It is what we refer to as an enlightened or managed app. In this scenario, it doesn't require the device to be managed. The device can be managed, no problem. It's just not required, right? And again, the scenario typically is the managed app is installed on the device by the end user from the Apple or the Google store. Doesn't have to be that way, but there, I'll just say it this way. There's if you have the user installed from the app stores, then if you ever need to clean up or do a selective wipe or a selective retire of the device, then those apps will remain installed. If you actually deploy it to the end user through the Intune company portal, if it is managed, then when you do a retire of the device, that app is removed as well. Again, some nuances that are different on Android and so on, but that's generally true. Managed device, which we're not doing here, but managed device, this will be where the devices are managed, and the admin is going to be the one to deploy the app, and the admin has vetted to make sure that the app can actually accept configurations, right? But we'll do that later. Here we're going to do a managed app. And so now I have to choose what managed app. So there's some thought as to possible approaches to this. So you see all the managed apps here. As I get down to Outlook, down here, here's for iOS. I can select this. Now, while I'm here, I can just as easily select another app and another app, right? And so what is the what is the approach you should take in terms of building app config policy? Well, in my mind, it makes a lot of sense to configure an app config policy uniquely for apps. To say it another way, it is absolutely totally possible to select multiple apps here, right? And you may want to if the settings are similar, but in reality, the settings may not be similar, and or maybe you just want to be able to see the settings uniquely deployed and so on. So deploying individually, I still think makes a lot of sense. Where it does make sense to put them together might be when you're using an app for both iOS and Android. So maybe Outlook, if you're doing it for both iOS and Android, it makes sense to configure the policy that way, right? And then deploy it to the users on iOS and Android, and the app config policy goes in that way, right? Or it could be that the app itself might have two versions that can, well, let me explain it this way. There could be a scenario where two similar apps that are different apps can accept the same settings. So you'll see one of those coming up. There's Edge and the managed browser that effectively can accept the same configuration settings. And so in that scenario, it might be okay to do the configurations together. However you do it's fine, just calling that out. Okay, so I have Outlook here. I'm going to hit OK. Now the configuration settings, I'm going to hit OK. Okay, good. So now the configuration settings. So here I am doing just a few things here. Now here is where you would enter name value pair if you don't have access to a nice UI for configuration, right? But we do have what's called a configuration designer for Outlook, so I'm going to use it instead, and I can then put in configurations that I want. So I'm just going to put in a few so that I know it's working. So focused inbox, I'm going to say no. Block external images, I'm going to say yes. And then let's see, there's one for signature, default app signature somewhere. Here, I'm going to say no, I don't want to use the default app signature. And now I have created my app config policy, right? The next thing I need to do is deploy this. So in this case, we are using a managed app. And the assumption with a managed app is that the device itself is not managed. Now, it could be a device that's managed, but the assumption is it's not. And so since we assume the device is not managed, then we really can't target these deployments to the managed device. Instead, we need to target to the user. Now, one thing that is potentially a little bit confusing here is that you can include a group of devices. In fact, I just had a conversation with a customer a few days ago where they were selecting devices and the app config policy or the app protection policy in their case was not going down. That's correct, because here, if we're targeting a managed app or an enlightened app, we have to do it with users, right? So I've already got this created. I'm not going to do it here. Let me show you the one that I actually have created for settings here. All right, and so my configuration here, right, the same thing you just saw. So we should be able to validate this on the app whenever we launch it. The targeted app is Outlook, just like you saw. There we go. And the assignment I've sent down to a group I call MAM. These are my MAM-enabled users, so I just reused that group. And so let's pull the Intune console out of the way, and let's actually look at the iOS device itself for a moment. All right, so this is my iPhone that I'm mirroring to my PC here. All right, and so specifically then, I'm going to move over. Now, the one thing that I want to show you real quick is you do see the company portal here, right? I'm going to launch the company portal and show you that although the company portal is here, the device itself is not managed, because the first thing that the company portal is going to do is it's going to enter into the enrollment workflow. The reason it does that is because it realizes it is not enrolled, right? So just to confirm that this device is not enrolled. Now, the other thing you see on here is that you see the Outlook app. So I'm going to launch this and confirm a couple of the settings that I did put in place are actually here. So this is a managed app. I'm going to put the ever secure pin of a bunch of ones, and I'm going to say no thanks, right? And so a couple of things. The first thing you notice is that the focused inbox is in fact off because I turned it off. The other thing, which I can show you, is that the default email signature is also disabled. So if I go down here, you will see signature is empty. Now, so that confirms that in fact the app config policy has been placed onto this device. Now, what I'm going to do is stop mirroring, on this, or stop sharing on this, and that's cool. As I mentioned earlier, this app config policy is a pull, not a push, And so I'm going to make a change in here that I hope by the end of this session will actually be in effect, so we can actually see this happen live. It may not make it, we'll see. But specifically, I'm going to turn back on the focused inbox. So I'm going to say yes and save that. And so within 30 minutes, in this case, I don't need to keep that. Here, let me get rid of that. Delete. Within 30 minutes, we should be able to see that the Outlook app now is set for focused inbox. All right, cool. So let's pull this out of the picture. And that's demo 1, talking about Outlook, right? What about demo 2, which is also focused on Outlook? So in this case, we're going to do things a little bit differently, right? This will be specifically focused in delivering the settings through the configuration designer, right? Same way. The target type will be, in this case, a managed device, right? Because the device I'm going to use is managed, and the configuration is going to be my accounts that I want to use. So I'm going to do this a little bit differently. The designer will look a little bit, or the way I get to it, some of the screens will look a little bit different, right? So let me go in, and I will show you, I already showed you, but let me do it again, that this device is in fact managed by Intune. So if I go to devices and let the screen load, we'll see that, again, that the iPad is in here. Again, it's kind of listed twice because of what I'm doing. All right, and then all devices. And here's the iPad. So we know it's managed. So let's go back over to client apps here. And we will look at the app configuration policies. Again, so it's easier to see. Here's my Outlook account. That's the one I'm going to mimic now. So let's click Add. So we're going to do a new app config policy this time. Again, I'll just, whatever. The deployment device enrollment type now will be managed device. Okay, again, just to belabor the point, managed apps is, you select that for apps that are provided by the vendor, leverage the Intune SDK. The configuration is going to be delivered by targeting users assuming that the device itself is not managed. Device can be managed. The assumption is it's not, right? Managed devices, this is where the devices themselves are managed. The admin, Intune admin, is going to be responsible for configuring or deploying the app to the device and making sure that the device is capable of receiving such deployments. Now, let's choose the platform. So under managed devices, we have to choose the platform. In this case, I'll choose iOS, and then select the required app. This screen will be different. You don't have the full list of the other apps that you saw before. Why? Because the list of apps that you saw before, those are managed apps using the Intune SDK. In this case, we're going to present to you the apps that you've configured for deployment in Intune, specifically store apps. Just because we show you the app on this list does not mean that the app is capable of receiving configuration. In this case, all of the apps are capable of receiving configuration, but that is not an assumption you should go forward with. You could have apps in this list that absolutely cannot receive configuration. Let me leave this for a minute. Effectively, this list of apps comes from here. Yes. So I've got a bunch of apps that I've deployed, and some of them are store apps, some of them are not, right? But this app configuration policy comes from there. So let me go back in and enter all that again. Manage devices, iOS. Okay, and then the required app in this case will be Outlook. So I know Outlook can take configuration settings, and the configuration settings I'm going to specifically apply to Outlook are now going to be for an account. Now, again, bit of a different format. I have three choices really for applying the setting. I can use Configuration Designer. I can enter name value pairs. I can use the XML editor, right? In this case, I'm going to use the Configuration Designer because it's nice. And if I didn't have the Configuration Designer, I could specify name value pair. But here I'm going to do email configuration. Yes. So what is my authentication type? Modern or basic? I'm going to choose modern. And so here it's going to give me a few options. I need to supply the username. Well, I don't want to just do it for one user, or I don't want to have to do a bunch of configs for every user. So I'm going to use the token or the wildcard user principal name. You don't see that this is using the token, but in effect, it is doing that when it builds the configuration for you. And the same thing, email address attribute from Azure AD, I'm going to use that. And I'm going to hit OK, and I'm good. The next thing I'm going to do is actually deploy this, but I've already got it deployed, and so I'm just going to cancel out at this point and go show you the one that I've got built. Here's for Outlook accounts right there. Okay, we'll go look at it, and we'll see the properties that we've got configured here, and so we'll look at the designer config. And just like I did a minute ago, it's all configured. I'm not doing any kind of app configuration here at all. Here, notice this. I didn't scroll down far enough to show you this, but this is the ability to supply that name, that key value pair. Again, this looks a little bit different than the one that you saw in the previous demo 1, right? Because you now have the ability to do a value type here, but same effective thing that you'll see in both places, right? Same effective thing. Okay, so this is done and it's deployed. I deployed it specifically to my device. Yes, that's fine. I've already got it deployed. And my group here is my iPad. So it is deployed to a device group. And so what I want to do is connect over to the iPad and show that to you. So let me share the iPad screen. And there we go. And here's my iPad. All right. So I'm going to sign into this device, and probably don't have to, but I'm going to move this aside because I do have to supply lock key information. Well, that's nice. I just now noticed that Apple doesn't let the key presses actually come through, which is awesome. Just show you the company portal again to show you that we are logged on here, or we are enrolled here, right? And the other thing I want to show you is the user. So specifically, I usually use the same user for everything I'm doing. I'm using a different user here. Specifically, I'm using user 1 because I want to make sure that I'm actually able to get my device or my account profile down to this device uniquely. And I know in the past, I've used my other account, and so it's still there from the other attempts, right? So let's get rid of all this. Great. Now, I have Outlook here, and so I'm going to open it, and this is really exciting, but the very first screen I'm going to get is choose an email account, right? And so you will see that I have user 1 here. I have a couple of other ones as well. I would have to supply detail if I want to use them, but here's user 1. And so the reason this is here is because I have that user profile set up, right? And so I'm just going to add this in. Oh, sorry, I can't click on it through the screen, can I? Okay, let's just add that in now. Add account, right? And so it goes and it loads that up, and some background processing that happens, and then we are all done. Notice that I have to enter the password. with any account that you choose, you will need to enter the password if Outlook can't figure it out through other hook-ins that it has to other managed apps or other Office apps or whatever. So this is a secure way. Even if I were to choose one of the two others, right, and it wasn't able to figure it out, I would have to enter a password. So protected for sure that way, right? Okay, so let's pull that out of the mix, and I will stop sharing on the iOS device. Give me just a sec to close that down, and we will go on to scenario number 3. All right, so we'll be back to the iOS device in a bit, right? But let's keep going. Pull the Intune console out. So those are the two scenarios with Outlook using the configuration designer. As you will see in demo 3, the next app can also use the configuration designer, but I'm not going to do it that way, right? So in this case, I'm moving back to a managed app, Edge in the managed browser. Two different apps, but they can accept the same configurations. I'm going to be deploying my configurations to an unmanaged device because I care about the managed app, and then we'll walk through the configs. Let me pull back in the Intune console. So here we are, and let's go into managed apps. And so here's my config for Edge. Well, let's go set that up ourselves. Okay, so let's go create that again, back to the theme that we keep talking about because it's important. As I go through this, I'm just going to set that up. Hopefully won't save it. The device enrollment type is managed app. A managed app is one that is capable of receiving config through the Intune SDK. It is an Enlightened app. It's in the store or in the list already. Whereas managed devices, that's not the case. You have to make sure the app itself is able to receive config, and you deploy it through Intune. That's what makes it available for configuration. So in this case, I'm going to choose Edge, and I'm also going to Edge for iOS, and I'm also going to choose Manage Browser for iOS because both can accept the same configurations. And then I'm going to go into configuration settings, right? So here, I do have the ability to use the configuration designer, and that's how I would normally do it. But I want to show you how to use the name value pairs, and so let's actually go and do that. So again, every app has different ways that it might receive name value pairs. In this case, I'm going to do name value pairs this way. In fact, I'm probably going to save some time and do some copy and paste. So bear with me as I go get the first key name. There it is, copy. I'm going to put this in, paste, right? So going forward, I'm just going to, I'll note that this part of the entry will be the same. The part that's going to change is down here. So app proxy redirector, I'm going to say I don't want that, right? That's fine. And so then the next key that I can configure will be here. So I'm going to say I want to configure the home page, right? And I want that home page to be, I'll just type it in, Bing, right? Great. And so I can keep going. And the next key value that I'm going to supply is to provide a list of pre-configured bookmarks that are important, maybe to my organization. And so this one I will definitely paste to make sure. The way you supply bookmark information in multiple entries is here I'm going to give it a name, Bing, and then I have a bar here, and then I'm going to supply the URL there. And then the second bookmark is separated by a double bar. It's going to be the Tech Community Blogs. There, that's the name. Here's a bar, and then here's the URL to the Tech Community. And then finally, it's going to be the Weather app. So I call that double bar to separate weather, standard bar, and then finally the URL to the weather app. Now, let me call out again. These configs are specific to Edge and the managed browser. Whatever app you're using may require different settings and probably will, right? But this is just examples of how to set this up. Now, the last thing that I'm going to configure is I can specify how I want to allow users to interact with the browser. And what I mean by that is I can specify websites that are allowed, meaning the browser is not able to go to any websites besides those, or I can specify websites that are blocked, meaning the browser can go to any of the websites that they want to, except for the ones that you specify. So here again, I'm just going to add in the websites I'm going to allow are being the tech community and weather, right? So all that's done, and I can hit OK. Now watch what happens. As soon as I do that, my configuration settings, they are still kind of listed here. This one actually looks like it's probably, maybe you got a typo in it, don't know. Either way, Edge configuration, though, is reflecting all the things that I just did. So the only thing it's not reflecting are the bookmarks, probably because I have a typo, but the one I have configured is set correctly, so we'll just go to that one. But my point is, once you configure them in the name value pairs, and if there's a configuration designer equivalent, it's just going to show them in the configuration designer, and your name value pairs won't show anymore unless there's maybe a problem somewhere, right? Okay, so let me go to the Edge Edge app that I do have configured. And so if I go to configuration, you will see I don't have anything here. In my configuration designer, I'm configuring bookmarks. I've got my allowed URLs. I've got my home page and such. And also I'm assigning this to my MAM group, which is my user. Okay, so let's go actually look at that on my iOS device. So let's pull this out of the picture. Cool. And this one is back to my iPhone, which has the app installed, but the iPhone itself is not managed. All right, so let's do that. Let me share my iPhone screen again. There. So we should be good. All right, so let's go back and look at, I'll use the Intune or the managed browser, and we'll just browse around for a minute. So you'll see the home page absolutely came up. It was Bing, right? The favorites are right here: Bing, tech community, weather, and so on. So really easy demo, but you see that those configuration settings were made on the managed browser, or on the managed browser, no problem. Same thing for Edge, but kind of redundant to show both. Okay. And then finally, Demo 4, Folder. So this is an app I didn't even really know anything about until I started looking for an app to demo here. So this particular app is one that's going to be configured by XML. So the configuration source is going to be XML, right? And then this is going to be deployed to a managed device. So the device is going to be managed, and my config policy right here is folders. So I've already got my config for folders set up. I'm not going to belabor the point again about managed app versus devices. I've done that enough, right? And so let's go in and configure this. I'll just do that. And my device enrollment type, managed device, right? And so platform, so I do have to choose a platform. So just a question, I forgot to mention earlier, why wasn't it an option in the managed app config, right? So if I do a managed app, there is no option to choose the platform. The reason why is because when you choose the app, it will be aligned with the platform, so we can figure out the platform from that. In this case, we're going to use iOS, and we're going to select the app from the list that I have deployed already. Here's folder, right? Okay. Now, the configuration settings here, I'm going to do from XML, right? From XML. And so I'm going to hit folder here, hit OK. And then the configuration settings specifically, I'm going to use XML. All right. And then I'm just going to paste in the XML. Let me copy the XML to my clipboard. I'll paste it in. All right. On the clipboard, here is the configuration. Now, I know absolutely nothing about the folder app. I just wanted to use it to configure and demonstrate the configuration was getting there. So I don't know what any of these are except for that one. That's the one you're going to see. And you'll see that there are a couple of different configurations here. There's an integer being applied. There's a string being applied. There's Boolean being applied here, here, and here, right? So I'm going to hit OK. And I'll come back to an XML discussion here in just a minute on another kind of approach. Or another example, right? So now that I've got that done, I can add this. Well, I don't want to add this because I already have folder configured here. So I'll just show you the one that I've got configured. Okay, so under properties, I have XML configured and formatted a little bit differently, but it's here, same exact thing, right? So it's already deployed, and this time it's deployed to my iPad again. So it's assigned to the iPad group. Actually, I assigned it to all users and devices. That's fine. So let's go and actually grab, let's share the screen of my iPad. Pull that off to the side. I'll share the screen of my iPad. This time I will trust Apple to not show the password whenever I come in here. And good enough. Cool. So I'll go to folder. And so I'm going to launch folder. It's a really exciting demo. You ready? Here we go. The only thing we're going to see here is that our sign-in information is already kind of filled in, folder.tailspintoys.com, because that's a configuration I provided, right? So it's definitely making it down to the device through XML. And so let me go ahead and stop sharing. But that hopefully gives you a sense that it did work and it is workable without a problem. Right? One other thing that I want to show you with in relation to configuring XML. Now, I've already mentioned, I'll mention it again here, that in order to do the config and know what config is available and how to do it, especially for apps that do not choose to use the Intune SDK, you have to go to the vendor to get that config. And so another managed app that's out there is Adobe, right? And you can provide configuration to Adobe. So far, I've not figured out the config because it's not working for me. I know it works, but I've not figured out I'm doing something wrong. But I want to use Adobe as an example to show you the config. So if you go to Adobe's EMM documentation, it will show you, oops, meant to open it with Notepad, it will show you an XML. It will provide you an XML that you can use with EMM or management solutions, such as Intune, to deliver config. It's just the problem is that, oh, come on. Open with there, if I pay attention to the work. The problem is this is what you're given. Let me turn off word wrap. This is what you're given. And so the tendency might be to just copy and paste this into Intune. Well, let's show you what happens whenever that is done. So I'm going to do a Control A, and I'm going to go into Intune, pull Intune back into the picture. And here I'm going to create a new app, whatever. It's going to be managed device. I'm going to choose iOS. Great. Go on down, select the required app, Adobe. So again, I may be doing something really silly and dumb here, probably am, but it's not working for me yet, but hopefully this will still illustrate. So go in, use the XML configuration designer. So probably what people will want to do is just go in and paste, and that's great. But immediately Intune will tell you, hey, there's something wrong because we validate the input. If you hover over this, it'll tell you comments aren't supported, right? Remove the comments. Well, that's true. Comments aren't supported. And so these little entries will have to be removed, but let's go do that. And what we will find out is that that's definitely not the only thing wrong, right? So let's go remove the comments there. Come back up. Go remove this comment. Great. And go on down, remove the next comment. There, great. Okay, so the comments, I believe, are removed, and so we think, okay, great, so it should be fine, right? No, because it's going to go validate it again and tell you the property list must begin and end with that DICT tag, right? So great. So what that really means is this whole piece up here probably isn't needed and doesn't have any useful information for us. And so we can go do that edit. And so go on down here and remove all of this. And I may be doing this wrong again. It doesn't work for me yet. I haven't figured it out. But now I've removed it. So all of the configuration is enclosed in this tag, right? And so go back and look, and it's going to still say, yeah, Boolean isn't supported, right? So that's all of this. And so the point is, I would have to go through and convert all of this. I'll just do one. Let me just do one here. So maybe up here, I would take out the Boolean and make an edit, because what we expect is key. All right, close that here. Get rid of the quotes. And then I will end with /key. Get rid of that. And then we don't expect this. We just expect to have a false slash or a true false or a true slash. So in this case, oops, come on. I can't tab in here like I would like to. Just put it on this line. So this is out of alignment, but still would work fine. So I would say true slash, and I would have to go convert all of these, and then we would be able to pass the designer at that point. And I've done that, and it still doesn't work, so I'm still doing something wrong. But just to call out, the XML that you receive is not necessarily going to be in a format that is going to work for you. So be aware. Okay, so those are the demos I want to show you. So demo 5, sorry, I forgot I had that, Adobe Acrobat XML. So I meant to switch to that either way, right? Now, the next thing, reporting. Being able to actually report on app config detail is important. So let's pull back in the Intune console and just talk through a couple of reporting things. I just realized that's wrong, so it shouldn't be man in action at that point, but I'll fix that later. Right, okay, so we do have a couple of reporting things that we can do to see actually what's going on. So back in this blade, if we scroll down, we have app protection status. Really shouldn't be named that because, yes, there are app protection reports here. There's also a couple of app config things here, and app config is definitely not protection. So here's the protected iOS apps. Here's the config status, right? So it's not just protection, it's config as well. And then I don't have anything for Android and so on. So we have the ability to see on the dashboards. We also have the reports here, and we can go look at the app configuration report and then look at our devices, so iOS, and then look at the specific app, Edge, and we will see here, this is the user that has it, right? And the other one, managed browser, here's the user, and maybe another one, Outlook, here's the user. So it's all the same user for me, but you see, the one you don't see here, the configurations you don't see here, are if you're managing the device, right? So that's a little bit of an oddity, but still, it gives you the information you want if, in fact, you are managing the app itself versus managing the device. Other options include being able to pull back information from the Graph API, Power BI. As we do this recording today, I know that there's some pretty significant changes coming to reporting to make it even more useful than maybe it is today. More of what people would expect kind of from standard reporting type solutions. So that's coming. Stand by for that. But those are the things that we have today. All right, and then finally, as we start to wrap up, I want to go through some troubleshooting tips kind of discussion as well. So this one's interesting. And when I did the app protection policy session, I didn't really show this. Should have, but so there's the ability as you're actually going through and troubleshooting how things work, right? Certainly there's logs that you can pull in and so on. Right? There's definitely logs you can pull in on the from the device, from the company portal. But what if you have a device that is not managed? You won't have the company portal, right? So there's still ways to dig in. So let me show you. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Yes, great. So here it comes, right? All right, so what I have the Intune managed browser here. I could do this through Edge too. I'll just do the managed browser. And so what I can do is type in about and then colon on this very small keyboard. Here, colon, and then Intune help. And what that's going to do, I didn't type that right apparently. Let's do that again. About, oh, I didn't type it right yet. I did not find. No, it took the whole thing away. About, colon, Intune help. So I think I've got it right now. Let's try it. So what that's going to do is actually launch a specific diagnostic portal that you can interact with. Now, again, a lot of this is going to be the app protection policies, which we're not talking about, but sometimes you might even wonder, did my app config policy even get down to the device? Is this, am I targeting the right thing, right? You might be targeting a user, but the account that's actually associated might be different than what you're talking about or what you're targeting, so that may be why the app config isn't getting there. But let me show you. So if I hit getting started, I can share my logs with maybe IT, internal IT at your organization. You can share the logs to Microsoft. And so you can go and do that. I can mail the logs to myself. I'll show you the logs that I mailed to myself in just a minute. I have those separate, so I'm not going to do it again, right? Or I can go through and I can view Intune app status. Well, what I have here is I can scroll through the various apps that I have configured. And so these are more, this is not every single thing that I've got there. This is managed browser, here's Edge, here's Office. These are protection policies. Here's Outlook, Word, OneNote. So there's some things that we talked about today, like folder and so on, that are missing, right? But you can absolutely see the last kind of detail about it. Let's look at Edge, right? So things like this. Here's the app version. Here's the last policy check-in. So I mentioned that with managed apps or with app config policy, it is a pull, not a push. So when did this app last check in? Did you deploy your config after the last app check-in? And so maybe you're still waiting for the app to check back in order to get that config. That's kind of stuff you can get from here, right? And so it's very, very useful info. Let me go back into that for a minute, see if I can find what I'm looking. So here's more detail about some of the stuff that might be configured. Look at this. We'll come back to this number in just a minute. Well, let's talk about it now, because you'll see it coming up right here, app check-in. So I mentioned that this is a pull. It is not a push, right? So if you have an app, this is specifically managed apps, right? If you have a managed app that has app protection policy applied to it, and you are applying app config policy as well, then you would expect that app to check in every 30 minutes. That's an online timeout, 30 minutes. If you have app config policy applied, but no app protection policy applied, every 720 minutes, a much, much longer timeout. Now, while I'm here, let me just say this. I mentioned before there's some iOS device went to sleep, apologies, that there's some documentation that appears to be in conflict. And here's what I mean. The documentation clearly says in one area, in order for you to apply app config policy to a managed app, you also must have app protection policy, right? And that's here, 30 minutes. But you'll see in other documentation the statement that says if you have app config policy applied, but no app protection policy, then your check-in interval for that app is going to be 720 minutes. That's reflected here. So those two seem to be in conflict. I can't definitively tell you because I haven't waited 720 minutes for app config policy to try to apply. I just call that out as something that confused me. And really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much because, again, you're going to generally apply app protection policy if you're doing a managed app, and so you'll get the 30-minute check-in. But be aware of that, and that's why I call that out. Right now, if you send the app to yourself, or if you send I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. If you send the log to yourself, then you'll be able to see even more detail. So I've emailed the log to myself, and here is that log. And so there's a lot in here that you might not, that we're not going to spend time working on here, but you'll see. Oops, let me make this even smaller. Sorry, font. This might take a second to resize. Might take it a minute. Do 14. Okay, so that did it pretty quick. So you'll see interactions as the device is talking with Intune and so forth. You'll also see configs for the different apps. So this is not necessarily hours and so on, but we'll keep going. Keep on going down. We just do page down a couple of times. Okay, I'm on. Well, instead of making you watch this, let me find the entry I'm looking for. I'll be right back. Okay, so as an example, this section I found. Now, this references MAM, right? But it's also talking about the managed browser, and I don't have any config policy deployed as app protection policy through MAM to the managed browser, but yet I see all sorts of detail about it, right? And a bunch of different things that I can go look for, different configs. Here's my bookmarks that I defined. And so those are definitely coming down. You can confirm them here, which is awesome that you can confirm your settings are actually getting to the device. The allowed URL settings is here. The other stuff that I have, my home page, all of that is configured. I could go through this and spend more time on it. I won't, just to show you additional troubleshooting options, right? Okay, a couple of tips. So for sure, you want to know whether your app supports managed configurations, being able to receive configurations. If it's a managed app that you see in the list when you're deploying to the managed app, you know it does. Aside from that, make sure you consult your vendor to see if it does. Now, another thing that's come up sometimes in conversations with customers is they will refer to the appconfig.org website. And that particular website contains Microsoft isn't listed as a vendor there. I don't know why we're not exactly, but AirWatch and MobileIron and others are there as participants. And again, I don't know why Microsoft isn't listed. I won't even speculate. But the key is, I was asked by a customer recently that all of these apps are listed on the appconfig.org website, and the way that you specify settings is kind of defined for each app. So it's kind of a clearinghouse where vendors can put their apps that are able to accept config and show how to give that config. And if you are a member of the appconfig.org, a user of the appconfig.org, you can consume that data and apply that configuration through the various platforms or the management platforms that are listed as being part of that organization. So the question came back, well, can you apply these same configurations through Intune? And the answer is absolutely, right? All you need to do is get what the configuration details are and then figure out, using one of the ways we've shown today, how you would actually do it. Maybe it's an XML that you put in and configure it. Maybe it's a key value, name value pair that you put in. Whatever the case may be, absolutely, that is the way that you can go through and get those configs applied for those apps that are not managed apps already in Intune. Right? It's a good source to be able to validate whether a vendor does support app config. Now, not every vendor that supports app config may be on that website. There may be others that do support app config that are not on that website, so be sure and check with your app vendor if you want to supply app config detail. I've already mentioned the check-in stuff, so I won't mention it again. All I will say is that wraps up the session today on app config. Really cool stuff. Take a look at it. Really makes it easier to manage apps and bring consistency to the experience. And that said, we will call it a session here, wrap it up, and we'll see you next time.